It began with a silence that felt unnatural. Then came the announcement no one saw coming. In a move that would fracture the monarchy's fragile unity, William, now acting as regent, made a decision so bold, so irreversible, it sent shockwaves through royal corridors and across the world. Titles stripped, futures rewritten. And at the center of it all, Harry's children, suddenly erased from the royal legacy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed was not just reaction, but rupture. An immediate, uncontrollable wave of disbelief that spread faster than the palace could contain it. The declaration itself was brief, almost cold in its precision, issued under William's authority with a tone that left no room for negotiation, no space for reversal. Only the unmistakable weight of finality pressing down on every word. Within minutes, the world was no longer watching the monarchy with admiration, but with stunned confusion, trying to understand how a decision of this magnitude could emerge so suddenly, yet feel so deliberate. It was not just the act itself that unsettled people, but the target, Harry's children. Not Harry, not the man at the center of years of tension, but the next generation, untouched by past conflicts, now pulled directly into the storm. That choice alone carried an emotional gravity that could not be ignored, raising questions that no official statement could fully answer. Inside the palace, the atmosphere reportedly shifted from controlled composure to something far more fragile, a tension that insiders described as both calculated and long-awaited, as if this moment had been quietly building behind closed doors long before the world was allowed to see it unfold. Every glance, every silence, every carefully measured step now felt loaded with meaning, suggesting that this was never an impulsive decision, but the culmination of something deeper, something strategic, something personal. Because stripping royal titles is never just about protocol. It is about identity, about legacy, about rewriting the very structure of belonging within the monarchy. It is power in its most visible form, a statement that does not ask for understanding, but demands acceptance. And yet, beneath the surface of that authority, there were already whispers, subtle but persistent, hinting that this move was not simply about maintaining order or preserving tradition, but about drawing a line that could not be crossed again. A line that would separate not just roles but relationships, not just titles, but blood itself. The more the world tried to make sense of it, the clearer it became that this was not the beginning of a story, but the eruption of one that had been quietly unfolding for years, hidden beneath royal smiles and carefully controlled narratives. And as the shock began to settle into something heavier, something more unsettling, a single question refused to fade, echoing through every reaction, every headline, every whispered conversation. But what could possibly push William to take such a drastic step, one that risks tearing the royal family apart from within? Power changes everything, but absolute power reveals everything. When William stepped into the role of regent, it wasn't just a temporary duty, it was a transformation. Behind palace doors, whispers began to grow louder. William was no longer waiting for the crown, he was acting like he already wore it. And in the shadow of that transformation, the monarchy itself began to shift in ways few fully understood at first. Because this was not simply about stepping in during a moment of need. It was about stepping forward with a clarity of purpose that had been forming long before the regency was ever announced. What appeared on the surface as urgency, an unavoidable responsibility thrust upon him, carried an undercurrent of something far more deliberate, as though William had been preparing, watching, learning, and waiting for the exact moment when hesitation would no longer be required. And when that moment came, he did not ease into power. He claimed it with a decisiveness that left even seasoned insiders unsettled. The authority that followed did not resemble the cautious restraint traditionally associated with royal duty. Instead, it expanded quietly but unmistakably, stretching beyond ceremonial boundaries into something more commanding, more assertive, more final. Decisions were made faster, directives carried sharper edges, and the usual layers of consultation began to thin, replaced by a sense that the regent's voice no longer needed to echo through others before becoming action. This was power streamlined, focused, and increasingly insulated from resistance. And as that authority grew, so too did the subtle reordering of the palace itself, a shift not announced, but felt in the changing dynamics of influence, where some voices suddenly carried more weight, while others seemed to fade into careful silence. Those who aligned with William's vision found themselves closer to the center, their presence more visible, their opinions more valued, while those who hesitated or questioned found the space around them narrowing, their relevance quietly slipping away. It was in these quiet rearrangements that the first true signs of transformation emerged, not through grand declarations but through controlled, calculated movements that suggested William was not simply maintaining the monarchy, but reshaping it. The direction he was setting felt different, less anchored in tradition, more focused on control, clarity, and a future that would no longer tolerate ambiguity or internal fracture. Advisors, often unseen but deeply influential, were said to be reinforcing this approach, encouraging strength over compromise, decisiveness over delay, urging him to act not as a placeholder, but as a leader defining his era before it had officially begun. And whether those voices guided him or simply echoed what he already believed, the result was the same: a regent who no longer operated within the quiet expectations of the role, but who used it as a proving ground, a space where limits could be tested, boundaries pushed, and authority exercised, without the full weight of the crown, yet with all the intent of someone preparing to carry it permanently. What made this transformation even more unsettling was not just its speed, but its precision, because nothing about it felt accidental, nothing felt reactive. Everything carried the imprint of strategy, of a long game unfolding step by step, decision by decision. The regency was no longer a pause in the monarchy's story, it was becoming a turning point, a moment where the future was being shaped in real time, often without the world fully realizing what was being set into motion. And as that future began to take form under William's steady, unyielding control, the consequences of his authority extended beyond policy and protocol, reaching into something far more personal, far more fragile, because power, once fully embraced, does not exist in isolation. It reshapes relationships, redraws loyalties, and exposes fractures that can no longer be ignored. And as William's authority grew, so did the distance between him and his own brother, a distance that had been quietly widening for years. Once inseparable, now irreparable. The bond between William and Harry wasn't broken overnight, it shattered piece by piece, moment by moment, until nothing remained but silence and resentment. And now, with one decisive act, that silent war has exploded into something far more permanent. What the world is witnessing today did not begin with a single decision or a sudden disagreement. It began years ago, in moments so subtle they were easy to overlook, in conversations that ended too quickly, in smiles that did not quite reach the eyes, in a growing distance that neither brother publicly acknowledged but both quietly felt. What once appeared as unbreakable loyalty slowly transformed into something far more fragile, as the pressures of expectation, responsibility, and identity began to pull them in opposite directions. William, bound to the weight of the crown, shaped by duty and the relentless expectation of leadership, found himself moving deeper into a role that demanded control, stability, and unwavering commitment to the institution. Harry, on the other hand, drifted further from that structure, questioning it, resisting it, and ultimately stepping away from it in a way that did not just create distance, it created a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. And yet, even as the world watched their paths separate, there were moments that hinted at something deeper, something unresolved, something quietly breaking beneath the surface. Public appearances became carefully managed, interactions measured, words chosen with precision rather than ease, as if both were aware that anything less than control could expose the tension they were trying so hard to contain. But behind that control, behind the carefully constructed image of unity, there were whispers, of disagreements that turned sharp, of conversations that ended without resolution, of a growing sense that trust itself had begun to erode. And when trust begins to fracture, everything else follows. The idea of betrayal, whether spoken or unspoken, began to take hold, shaping perceptions, influencing decisions, turning past wounds into present motivations. Because betrayal does not need to be proven to be powerful, it only needs to be felt. And in this case, it seems it was felt deeply. Harry's decision to step away from royal duties did not just create physical distance. It intensified the emotional divide, transforming what may have once been repairable into something far more complicated. It was no longer just about disagreement. It was about departure, about rejection, about a choice that from one perspective could be seen as liberation, but from another, as abandonment. And in that space between those two interpretations, resentment found room to grow. What may have once been quiet frustration began to evolve into something more personal, more charged, more difficult to ignore. Private confrontations, though never fully revealed, are said to have carried a tone far removed from the unity the public once believed in. Conversations that were no longer about understanding, but about defending positions, about holding ground, about drawing lines that neither side was willing to cross. And now, standing in the aftermath of William's decision, it becomes impossible to ignore the possibility that this was never purely about duty or protocol, that beneath the surface of authority and responsibility lies something far more human, far more emotional. Because decisions of this magnitude do not exist in isolation, they are shaped by history, by perception, by unresolved conflict that quietly builds until it demands to be expressed. And in this case, that expression has taken a form that feels both calculated and deeply personal, as if the line between leadership and emotion has blurred in a way that changes everything. Which raises a question that refuses to be dismissed, one that lingers beneath every explanation and every justification, growing louder with each passing moment. But if this decision was fueled by personal history, why target the next generation? Children who had no role in the conflict. This wasn't just a royal decision, it was a generational rupture. Stripping titles from Harry's children crossed a line many believed would never be touched. So why them? Why now? And what message was William really sending? To his brother, to the monarchy, and to the world? The questions did not wait for answers. They multiplied, deepened, and spread with a force that mirrored the shock of the decision itself. Because in the long, carefully guarded history of the monarchy, there had always been boundaries, unwritten but understood, lines that even power hesitated to cross. And yet, in a single, decisive act, those lines were not just approached, they were erased. Targeting children in a royal restructuring was not merely unusual. It was unprecedented in a way that forced even the most loyal observers to pause, to reconsider what they thought they understood about the rules that governed this institution. This was no longer about managing roles or refining titles, it was about redefining who belonged and who did not, and doing so in a way that would echo far beyond the present moment. Speculation surged almost immediately, not as idle curiosity but as an urgent attempt to make sense of something that felt both strategic and deeply personal. Some began to suggest that this was not about punishment, but about precision, a deliberate effort to redraw the boundaries of succession with clarity that left no room for ambiguity. In that interpretation, the decision was not emotional, but calculated, designed to secure a future where the monarchy could operate without internal conflict or competing claims. Yet even within that logic, there was an unease that could not be ignored. Because if stability required such a drastic step, what did that say about the state of the institution itself? Others saw something far less measured, interpreting the move as punitive, as an extension of a personal conflict that had now reached into the lives of those who had never been part of it. Words like deeply personal and unforgiving began to surface, not as accusations, but as reflections of a discomfort that could not be easily dismissed. And at the center of all this, often overlooked in the rush to analyze power and intention, were the children themselves, figures who until now existed within the royal narrative as symbols of continuity, of future, of possibility. With one decision, that narrative shifted, leaving behind questions of identity that no title could fully define, but whose absence would be impossible to ignore. What does it mean to be born into a legacy and then see it removed? What remains when the structure that once defined belonging is suddenly taken away? These were not questions the palace could answer with statements or explanations, because they extended beyond protocol into something far more human, far more complex. Legacy is not just about inheritance, it is about connection, about knowing where one stands within a story that stretches across generations. And now that connection had been altered in a way that could not simply be undone. At the same time, voices of support emerged, firm and unwavering, arguing that this decision, however difficult, was necessary to preserve the integrity of the monarchy itself. From this perspective, the act was not an attack, but a correction, a step toward a more defined and stable future, where the institution could function without the complications that had long threatened its unity. It was framed as strength, as leadership willing to make choices others would avoid, as a commitment to the crown that placed its survival above all else. But even within that support, there was an acknowledgement, quiet but present, that such strength comes at a cost, and that cost is rarely limited to those who make the decision. Because beyond the arguments, beyond the speculation, beyond the attempts to justify or condemn, there remained a deeper, more unsettling truth. Something fundamental had changed. Not just in structure, not just in hierarchy, but in the very definition of what the monarchy was willing to do to preserve itself. And once a line like that is crossed, it does not simply disappear, it redefines everything that follows. Which is why the reaction did not settle into acceptance, but intensified into something far more volatile. As voices clashed, opinions hardened, and the world outside the palace began to respond with a force that could no longer be contained. Because as outrage and support collided, the palace walls struggled to contain the storm that was rapidly building outside. Behind the grandeur of palace gates, chaos was unfolding. Advisors scrambling, loyalties shifting, and a family divided more visibly than ever before. This wasn't just a decision, it was a crisis spiraling beyond control. What had begun as a single decisive act was now unraveling into something far more unpredictable, as the inner machinery of the monarchy struggled to absorb the shock it had created itself. Inside those walls, where composure is expected and unity is carefully maintained, a different reality was taking hold, one marked by tension, uncertainty, and a growing sense that control was slipping through even the most experienced hands. Conversations that would normally be measured and discreet were now urgent, charged with emotion, and often left unresolved, as senior figures found themselves divided not just by opinion, but by loyalty. Disagreements that had once remained buried beneath protocol were now rising to the surface, impossible to ignore, as advisors and royal figures grappled with the consequences of a decision that seemed to move faster than their ability to contain it. Some stood firmly behind William, seeing strength in his willingness to act decisively, believing that this moment required exactly the kind of authority he had demonstrated. Others, however, viewed the situation with growing unease, questioning not just the decision itself but the precedent it set, and whether the monarchy was stepping into territory it might not be able to retreat from. These were not quiet differences of perspective, they were fractures forming in real time, lines being drawn in conversations that carried far more weight than anyone was willing to admit publicly. Emergency meetings began to take shape, not as routine gatherings, but as attempts to regain a sense of direction in a moment that felt increasingly unstable. Behind closed doors, discussions turned intense, sometimes strained, as alliances that once felt secure began to shift under pressure. Those who had long stood side by side now found themselves on opposing sides of an argument that reached beyond policy into something far more personal and consequential. And within those discussions, there was an unmistakable realization. This was no longer about managing a situation. It was about navigating a turning point that could permanently alter the monarchy's path. Even among the most senior figures, reactions were far from uniform. The queen consort, often seen as a stabilizing presence, remained outwardly composed, but her silence carried its own weight, leaving many to wonder whether it reflected agreement, hesitation, or quiet resistance. Others within the inner circle responded with caution, choosing their words carefully, aware that any misstep could deepen the crisis rather than contain it. And then there were those who chose not to speak at all, their silence not a sign of neutrality, but of a deeper uncertainty about where this moment was leading and what it might demand next. Meanwhile, beyond the official statements and controlled appearances, fragments of the internal struggle began to emerge. Staff leaks, subtle yet revealing, hinted at a level of unrest rarely associated with an institution built on discipline and discretion. These glimpses painted a picture of an environment under strain, where confidence was no longer absolute, and where the usual certainty that defined royal operations had been replaced by something far more fragile. And as those fragments reached the outside world, they began to shape a narrative that the palace could not fully control. one that suggested the crisis was not just external, but deeply rooted within. At the heart of it all was a growing fear, unspoken but undeniable, that this moment could cost the monarchy something far more valuable than titles or tradition. Public trust, once assumed to be steady, now felt uncertain, as the decision and its aftermath raised questions that could not be easily answered. Because if the institution could turn inward with such force, what did that mean for its connection to the world beyond its walls? And as that question lingered, growing heavier with each passing moment, it became clear that this crisis was no longer contained within the palace. Because while the palace struggled internally, the outside world was already delivering its verdict. The world was watching, and it wasn't staying silent. From outrage to disbelief, the public response exploded across continents, turning a private royal decision into a global controversy that threatened to shake the monarchy to its core. Headlines surged with urgency, each one sharper than the last, framing the decision not as a moment of leadership, but as a rupture that demanded explanation. Networks debated it relentlessly. Commentators clashed, and the narrative fractured into competing interpretations that only deepened the intensity of the moment. For some, William's action was seen as bold, a necessary assertion of control in an institution long criticized for hesitation. For others, it felt deeply unsettling, an overreach that crossed an invisible boundary and left lasting emotional consequences in its wake. The divide was immediate and unrelenting, splitting public opinion into two opposing forces that refused to reconcile. As the debate intensified, social media became its own battlefield, amplifying every perspective, every theory, every emotion. Speculation moved faster than facts, building layers of interpretation that blurred the line between analysis and assumption. Some voices demanded accountability, calling for transparency in a decision that felt too significant to remain unexplained. Others defended the move with equal conviction, arguing that the monarchy's survival depended on difficult choices that the public might never fully understand. But beneath the arguments, beneath the noise, there was a deeper shift taking place. Questions about relevance, about whether an institution built on tradition could continue to operate in a world that demanded clarity and fairness. The monarchy, once insulated by its distance, now found itself exposed to a level of scrutiny that felt impossible to contain. And then, almost unexpectedly, the focus began to narrow. The headlines, the debates, the outrage, all of it started to circle around one absence that became impossible to ignore. Because while the world reacted, while voices grew louder and more divided, one voice remained completely silent. Harry said nothing. No statement, no immediate response, no visible reaction to a decision that directly altered the lives of his children. And in that silence, something shifted again. What had been a global reaction became something more intimate, more personal, as attention turned toward the man at the center of it all. Silence can be louder than any statement, and Harry's silence was deafening. As the world waited, every second without a response only deepened the tension, turning anticipation into something almost unbearable. Speculation quickly filled that void, with insiders suggesting that behind the silence was not weakness, but calculation. A man processing a moment that was both deeply emotional and strategically significant. The weight of the decision was not abstract for him, it was immediate, personal, and impossible to separate from his identity as a father. The idea that his children had been stripped of something so deeply tied to legacy carried an emotional gravity that could not simply be dismissed or absorbed without consequence. And yet, instead of reacting, instead of stepping forward with anger or defiance, he remained still, as if choosing his next move with precision rather than impulse. That stillness only intensified the questions. Was he preparing to respond in a way that would reshape the narrative entirely? Was there a legal challenge forming behind closed doors, or a public statement waiting for the exact moment to have maximum impact? And within that uncertainty, another layer emerged. Meghan's influence, often discussed but rarely confirmed, now seen as a possible guiding force in how this response would unfold. Because silence, in a moment like this, is never empty. It carries intention, strategy, and meaning that cannot be immediately understood. And as the world leaned in, waiting for that silence to break, the tension reached a point where it could no longer remain just about reaction or response, because something deeper was beginning to surface, something that extended beyond personal conflict into the very structure of the institution itself. And as the tension reached its peak, a deeper question began to surface. Was this really about family, or the future of the monarchy itself? What if this wasn't just a decision, but a blueprint? A calculated move designed not for today, but for decades to come. Beneath the emotional fallout lies a possibility far more unsettling, that William is reshaping the monarchy in ways no one fully understands yet. Because when the noise fades and the immediate shock begins to settle, what remains is not just the impact of the moment, but the intention behind it. And that intention, many now believe, stretches far beyond a single act of authority. It points toward a vision, quiet, deliberate, and undeniably bold, of a monarchy stripped down to its most controlled, most defined form. A monarchy no longer weighed down by extended branches, competing identities, or blurred lines of succession, but instead rebuilt with precision, where every role is clear, every position earned, and every future conflict addressed before it can even begin. This is where the narrative shifts from reaction to revelation, from emotion to strategy. Because removing titles from Harry's children may not have been about exclusion alone, it may have been about restructuring the very framework of royal identity itself. A streamlined monarchy, smaller in number but stronger in control, has long been discussed in quiet circles. An idea that suggests less visibility could mean more stability. Fewer voices could mean clearer direction. And within that framework, William's decision begins to look less like a sudden rupture, and more like the first visible step in a plan that has been forming over time. A plan designed to eliminate uncertainty, to reinforce a singular line of succession that cannot be questioned, and to ensure that the future of the crown is not left vulnerable to internal division. But even within that logic, there is something deeply unsettling, because clarity often comes at a cost. To define the future so sharply means removing anything that does not fit within it, even if that removal carries emotional consequences that cannot be undone. And in doing so, William is not just acting as a leader responding to the present. He is positioning himself as a force shaping what comes next, a figure willing to make decisions that will echo long after the moment has passed. This is not preservation in its traditional sense. This is transformation, a shift that challenges the balance between heritage and evolution, between loyalty and control. And if this truly is the direction he intends to take, then what has already happened may only be the beginning of a much larger change. Because every structure, once reshaped, creates new possibilities, but also new risks. The more defined the monarchy becomes, the less room it has to absorb disruption, and the more each decision carries the weight of permanence. Which brings everything back to a single, unavoidable question: whether this path leads to strength or to fracture. The crown has always symbolized unity, but now it stands divided. What began as a single decision has unraveled into something far more profound, a question not just about power but about survival. Is this the monarchy evolving, or quietly collapsing under its own weight? The long-term consequences are no longer theoretical. They are already taking shape in strained relationships, in shifting loyalties, in a growing sense that the institution is standing at a crossroads where tradition and transformation cannot coexist without tension. Public trust, once steady, now feels uncertain, balanced between those who see strength in change and those who see loss in what has been left behind. And within that uncertainty lies the emotional legacy of this moment, one that will not fade with time but deepen, shaping how future generations understand not just what was done, but why. Because decisions like this do not remain isolated, they redefine identity, belonging, and the meaning of legacy itself. And as the monarchy moves forward, carrying both its history and its new direction, there remains a lingering sense that something irreversible has already taken place. Because in the end, this wasn't just about titles. It was about rewriting a legacy that may never be the same again. And the world is still watching what happens next. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.